Good artists borrow, great artists steal. Which is to say, in today's video, I'm kitbashing a Chaos Lord for Warhammer 40,000 that borrows a truckload of inspiration from some iconic artwork from the old world. Rather than overthink things, let's get stuck in, at the bottom of the model with a pair of Cataphractii Terminator legs. I chose a pair that was best suited, but even then they needed a little, surgical attention around the groin to better match the pose. A fine razor saw made a nice clean cut along the joint, which meant that after a course of the usual cleanup business, I could reattach the upper leg without having to resculpt any of the joint detail. I like to sand all the texture off my bases to keep myself busy during those long winter nights. And as it happens, this proved useful here as a temporary base for Mr. Deathsword, the new smoothness being a bit friendlier for some later green stuff cape shenanigans. Oh, and if you're wondering, this is a rough breakdown of the key parts of the model. The torso comes from the Age of Sigmar Chosen kit, and like the legs, it also needed a bit of invasive groin surgery, though in this case it was sufficient to just give it the snip. That being said, the razor saw is never far away in one of my builds, and once the glue had fully cured, both the legs and the torso underwent a bit of waste management. Yeah, that was awful. Anyway, the legs and the torso went together without much fuss, only needing a small amount of gap filling. I use sprue glue here, which I like to employ on more organic shapes, as the surface can be smoothed over with additional liquid cement. This often completely removes the need to clean up the joint with abrasives afterwards, which can be a challenge in hard to reach areas or on complex shapes. Speaking of complex shapes, the Terminator shoulder pads needed to be stripped of all that lovely detail. I've lost track of the number of times I've gone to battle with a Crux Terminatus, but I can tell you that a scalpel always comes out on top. And to disguise my crime against the Imperium, a little bit of friendly rubbing was needed, first with a fine-grained sanding stick, followed by a fiberglass pencil. I probably should have chopped the bottom of the shoulder pad flush before tidying all that up. Oh well, let's drill some holes for the spikes. They're 0.9mm for all the numerologists watching. This banner pole icon from the Sigmar Chosen kit is a great source of spikes, which is handy since it was right there in front of me. And hopefully this should explain why I chose to drill pilot holes. Spikes are always fragile on Wargames figures, but hopefully this gives Monsieur Deathsword a fighting chance of retaining his pointy majesty. That being said, I did have to roll the dice on the upper shoulder horns. These came from the Citadel Skulls kit, by the way. They're an awkward size that's too small to pin, but too big for guide holes, so I'm relying on chemistry. I threw on some nail art beads, which look comically oversized here, but I promise they do read properly on the finished model, but you're going to have to take my word for that because it's time for skull knees. Oh, would you look at that? At this point, I decided to pop on the shoulders and turn my attention to Senor Deathsword's Deathsword. I had planned on making this from scratch, but there's a sword in the Chosen kit that's pretty damn close and life is very short. So I borrowed a hand from the Legionnaire's kill team sprue that had the perfect pose and cobbled together the pieces of the sword around a 1mm brass rod. The hilt came from an axe, but I don't think there's any reason to write a strongly worded letter. On the other side of the model, I thought a regular axe just wasn't going to cut it in the 40k setting. And besides, I'm not making an exact copy of the art, just using it as a jumping off point, which is to say, chain axe. By removing the extra hand and rotating the head of the axe from the Legionnaire's kit, which is a double-handed affair, I could make a chain axe worthy of Herr Deathsword. Obviously, with the number of individual parts, this relied on more than a couple of brass pins to keep it all together. It's head time, and this animation should illustrate the approach. It does look very slick, but the reality of making it's a bit more snippers and thumbs. But I got there in the end. I haven't mentioned yet, but I kept the head and limbs separate throughout the build to make painting easier, hence why some of the joints look like a complete disaster at this stage. Speaking of joints, it's time to bulk out the torso around the shoulders. Nothing fancy here, just some green stuff infill in the Chosen torso, which I flattened off to allow the shoulder pads to attach perpendicularly, which is probably a real word. Like all good belts, this one started life with a small sliver of styrene tube backed with some 0.25mm sheet, which was chopped about and sanded flush, but not on camera, that'd be too professional. This Skull Demon trinket thing from the Chosen kit looks pretty close to Adrian's artwork, and proved to be the perfect fit, which was, well, pretty handy. And with the easy bit out of the way, I broke out the green stuff, which I flattened to a thickness of around 1mm. After a couple of hours of curing time, I chopped the belt to shape with a scalpel and a sharpened tube, obviously. I then let it fully cure overnight before gluing in place with some super glue. Green stuff of this thickness is still pretty flexible, thankfully. There's not a lot of detail on the belt itself, as it's covered by a pair of knives, which I cobbled together with some Space Marine scabbards and the handles from some Cadian knives, which looked a bit more appropriate. This is me losing confidence in the head. While the Age of Sigmar head is closer to Adrian's artwork, I was really concerned that my model wasn't reading as 41st Millennium. So obviously my Terminator armor build got a power armored head. Don't overthink it, it's fine, it's just fine. Time for a bit of ragged cloak action. Like the belt, I flattened out some green stuff to around 1mm thick. The bit of styrene I use is coated with Vaseline to stop it sticking, unlike the clear plastic that I'm building on, which sticks but not that well, which is helpful. After around 3 or 4 hours of curing, I cut the basic shape from a paper template I made. And after a couple more hours, I cut in the ragged details. At this stage, the green stuff isn't sticky and it doesn't bulge when you try to cut it, but it's still quite flexible, which is important for the next bit. Once everything was fully cured, I cleaned up the edges, but I don't have time to talk about that because, yeah, power armor backpack. Probably shouldn't be there. But I thought it looked cool, and I've just decided he's a big boy firstborn lad with a bit of the old demonic gift of being 15% taller than an Indomitus Terminator. There you go, it's fine, it's law now. With that, Quagmire deftly parried. Can you parry a Quagmire? Anyway, I moved on to the base. I hacked up some 4mm styrene profile to make curbstones and installed them on the front of the base. I backfilled the area behind it with some styrene sheet and made some tiles in much the same way as the curbstones before cutting everything back flush. I'm part of Team Big Bases on Hero models because I like having a nice big scenic base, and the only downside is it might stop me from having a game with the sort of person that gets really fanatical about base sizes, which, now I think about it, isn't really a downside. Which is a roundabout way of saying I wanted to pay homage to the corpse pile in the original artwork by hacking, twisting, and re-gluing some leftover Cadian parts until things started to make some kind of sense. I don't think you can really plan out this sort of thing, you just have to start building and adding things and seeing where it takes you. With helpful tips like that, it's a wonder I've got a channel, really. Anyway, I decided the model would look cool if it were framed by a Gothic arch, but I couldn't find anything in the bits box that fit the bill. So I made my own in much the same way as I made the floor. I added some broken bits of rebar because, what, you think they're not making concrete faux blockwork walls in the 41st millennium? Pull the other one. After a bit of assembly, followed by some ground cover from Vallejo earth texture, the build was complete. Notice one of the scabbards is missing. I didn't. Well, not until the moment I started filming these shots, which is a pretty confusing segue. Anyway, I didn't really want to talk about paint in this video because, well, any excuse to avoid it really, so have some finished shots of Old Man Deathsword. I really love using artwork as a jumping off point for creating a model. Sometimes the model follows closely, other times it simply takes a few key hints. But it's always fun, and this was a fun build and a nice palette cleanser before my next project, which is big and loyalist, so less room for cartoonish gore and other such silliness. But it is big,